Today's keynote is really interesting, and I think it's going to be a great format, a Q&A. But to give just a little bit of background on Joe Inzerillo, is he actually has spent 30 years in Major League Baseball. He started out as a cameraman for the Chicago White Sox years ago, but now has gone all the way up, and for the last, I guess, dozen or so years has been working with BAMTech and a spin out of Major League Baseball. So, if you would please welcome to the stage to be Q&A by Eric Schumacher Rasmussen, the editor for Streaming Media Magazine, Joe Inzerillo, EVP, CTO BAMTech, and Eric Schumacher Rasmussen.
Well, good morning. I'm really excited to have this chance to sit down with Joe and talk about what BAMTech is doing. Over the last several years, I think it was it Forbes who a few years ago called, well, it was Mlbam then, but called it the biggest, greatest media company no one's ever heard of?
Yeah, it's true.
How many people in the room are familiar with BAMTech? Okay, most of you are, but for the few that aren't, Joe, can you kind of give a little bit of background of how Mlbam came out of MLB and then how BAMTech has come off of that?
Sure. So in 2000, the owners got together and realized that the internet was going to be kind of a big thing. It was sort of the tail end of the first bubble, and there was a lot of things that were out there, and it made sense to try to figure out how to best monetize the rights that baseball had. But they realized that they weren't going to do that within a 100-year-old institution, and so they hired a CEO. They completely carved out those rights and created a separate entity that just started with the internet rights. Streaming didn't really exist, although we streamed our first game in 2002. So we were pretty early on the scene. But it was digital ticketing, it was banner ads, it was really websites at that point in time. But from that it evolved, and we got pretty good at streaming, and we started to do things for other clients, et cetera, et cetera. And fast forward to August of last year, Disney made an investment in BAMTech, which is basically the streaming business, service provider business carved out. And they put $1 billion into it on a $3 billion value to go ahead and really take this company to the next level.
So that's obviously allowed you to expand. I see you've also looked at, or you are expanding in Europe as well?
Yeah. We, after we did the Disney transaction, we did another transaction with Discovery Networks where we have a joint venture with them, BAMTech Europe, where we're basically building a Eurosport player for Discovery post their acquisition of Eurosport. And so that's got us a flagship headquarters in Amsterdam. We have some facilities there that are already online. We're building our TOC and office space out right now. So, we're very excited about that, launching product shortly, and really with our eye on the ball for the Olympics in 2018, which Eurosport has the rights to.
So how much of what BAMTech does is it all live streaming, or do you do some VOD as well?
We definitely do VOD. I mean, it's people that do VOD don't always do live, but people who do live always do VOD. Because you have archives, you have highlights, you have things like that you want to put into the product. So you have to get very good at both. We've had some pretty good experience with WWE Network, which has a very extensive VOD catalog as one of our customers, as well as HBO Now, principally a VOD service, although a little bit of live sprinkled in there now as well. So we feel like we're pretty adept with both. Certainly our DNA has been wired for live. And we think that's a big part of the value proposition of streaming on a go-forward basis, is being able to have stuff timely / live when you need it, and then also have deep catalogs that you can browse to fill out the offering.
Sure. I programmed the live streaming summit portion of the show this year, and in the live streaming summit yesterday, the best attended session was about live linear. And certainly Tian from Hulu spoke about their new live linear service. That's kind of been the story of the last year in live, is this, not quite an explosion yet, but certainly there's new live linear services popping up all over the place. What do you see as the demand for live linear, and where do you think it's headed? How does it have to be packaged to be successful?
Well, I mean, live linear is certainly important still to the industry. We power PlayStation Vue with Sony, so we've had a lot of experience in live linear for quite a bit of time ourselves. I know, as Tien would say and did say yesterday, live's hard. There's a lot of things that happen in live that don't necessarily happen in VOD. And so I think the industry is now starting to become a little bit more comfortable with the fact, yes, you can do this and you can make it work, and you can provide very high quality. I think as far as what it means, content is, it's easy sort of in an SVOD world to understand what the value proposition is. one could make the argument that an OTT service has a lot more flexibility in getting content to users in an SVOD notion. Big catalogs, watch whatever you want, binge watch seasons of things. It's very different consumption paradigm than what we've had before. But linear evolved for reasons as well. Not just technological, but the way that it proliferated, I think, is one of those things that there is still a value proposition to that, and people do still like linear. Sometimes they just want to turn on a favorite channel and just soak in what's there. And so I think the industry is now reacting, and you're seeing these virtual MVPDs, you're seeing more linear out there. And I think, in our world, it's not one or the other, it's the plurality.
Right.
The content offering is just going to get fuller and fuller and fuller. And so sometimes it'll be live events, sometimes it'll be live linear, sometimes it'll be VOD, sometimes it'll be archive, time delay, kind of anything that you can think about is a consumption model we want to empower for our fans and our customers so that they can understand that when they come to this service, they get what they want, when they want it, where they want it.
Right. Do you see that cannibalizing pay TV?
I don't think it's a matter of cannibalization. To me is one of those things that I don't really like that term because I don't think it's necessarily accurate. Cannibalizing to me is really the notion of like cord cutters. Like, I'm not going to do this, I'm going to go do that. And certainly there's a little bit of that. But I think from our perspective, it's really cord nevers. That's what's really happening. And so folks are aging out of the top end of cable TV, and the folks that are coming up are just not buying cable TV or pay TV in the same way, at the same numbers and the same penetration that they used to. A lot of folks are looking for alternatives. And so with our friends at Sony or our friends at Hulu, they're now offering cable-like packages, if you will, pay TV-like packages that have a lot of the same content or all the same content, but it's delivered in a way that's more familiar to them, more comfortable with them. I mean, for folks that have a lot of brand loyalty, let's say to Hulu, those folks have been consuming SVOD from those guys for quite some time. So the notion of like just expanding the offering of what they can have is a logical extension of that, and I think it really resonates with customers. The oft used millennial notion of it, but if you're 20, 23 years, 25 years old, just out of college, you're living on your own, you're price sensitive in a big way. You were probably price sensitive 30 years ago in the same way. There just wasn't a lot of options.
Right.
And so now you really do have options about where you want to get your entertainment. And you live in a device world. You don't live in a cable box world. And so I have this Apple TV, I have this Roku device, I have this PlayStation, I have all these different devices. I'm used to getting content. That's my principal mechanism of consuming content, let alone mobile devices, obviously. Right. But we're seeing that, and we're seeing that usage pattern repeat. So to me, it's not so much cannibalization as it is segmentation. And segmentation that's now being well served by products that are out there that perhaps technologically were very difficult to well serve 10 years ago.
Well, you said that there's still a demand for live linear. Is that a legacy demand, or are you seeing and anticipating that demand continuing from millennials and younger who have never had that sit down, turn on a channel, and just watch experience?
No, I definitely think that there's demand for live linear. I think it comes in many forms. And so, typically live linear has been this kind of waterfall of, here's master control, we're going to program these things, we're going to slot them in, et cetera, et cetera. I would make the case, though, that like if you're in a service and you go and you start up a piece of content, and then as soon as that content's over, it takes you into another piece of content, possibly related or possibly just recommended to you based upon what you watched, and you can continue to do that for extended periods of time.
Right.
That's linear.
Right.
It may not be like originated in the same way, but it's still a linear consumption model. And so I think if you look at the data out there, there are definitely a lot of folks that turn on services. And much the way that I think a lot of TV was consumed in a semi-passive way, I'm doing other things and I'm also watching TV. I think people are absolutely doing that there. So I think that there's an appetite for it and there's a demand for it. I think it will take many forms and it will continue to evolve. And so the strict linear sort of 1 to 100,000 or 100 million people watching, maybe not as much of that. I think it'll evolve, but I do think the consumption pattern of like this is my content companion and I'm doing other things. I think that stuff absolutely still goes on.
Sure, and I suppose even young kids who watch almost nothing but YouTube, they're in an environment where they go to the next video, they watch what plays next, so it's still, like you said, a linear concept. What about for a number of years? OTT was sort of used as a blanket term to cover any video service that was, or any other kind of service that was delivered over the top of an existing public network. But in recent months especially, I'm seeing and hearing more people really want to distinguish between OTT, TVE, How do you see the differences between those services, and what should we use to define those services?
No, it's a good question. I mean, obviously, like a TVE service and an OTT service share a lot of technology, but we definitely see them as very separate things. You know, TVE fundamentally, kind of by definition, somebody's buying something that's different. So, like, they're buying the pay TV, and then they're using this other thing. Now, obviously, we think the other thing's valuable and people pay for it, but just the way that you go about thinking about things is tough. Like if you have a pay TV service and you have a TVE application and you're having issues, it's possible that you're going to call and cancel your cable, but it's probably not super likely. Whereas if you're OTT and that's the product, you are selling the thing that people are buying. If you have problems, if you have issues, if the user interface isn't good, if all these things, then it leads to churn. Immediately. And so churn is one of the most important things. Like the great news about OTT is it's accessible. People can get into it, they can buy it, you know, it's a la carte, and that's great. We think that's fantastic. The bad news for the people that are operating the business is they could just as easily unsubscribe.
Right.
And you know, churn mitigation is really important. So if you look at what people do, like where they place their bets, how they think about the ecosystem, there are differences. There are things that I see people do sometimes in a TVE world that I'm like, I would just never do that in an OTT world. I'll give you an example in specific. You know, when you look at advertising, advertising is a pretty good thing to look at because if you're TVE and the only way to direct monetization is advertising, perhaps you're going to take some more risks. Perhaps the technology that you have, you know, is okay, but let's say it has a couple of % defect rate. So somebody maybe gets a ABR or a black frame or some other sort of, you know, defect in the stream that they otherwise wouldn't have gotten, but you know, because of advertising. In a TVE world, that's okay. You're like, you know what, that's acceptable. There's not really anything else out there that's better. I'm going to go ahead and do that. But in an OTT world, you really have to think hard because if that defect rate, you know, call it 2%, if that's going to lead to a % of churn, that's a huge problem. And so just the way that I think people go about it from a mentality standpoint of curation, OTT products tend to be cared for more than TVE products, which is not to say there aren't great TVE products out there. There certainly are some. But I think in general, OTT is like you have to produce every day. You are selling the very thing, and the friction of unsubscription is very low.
Right. Right. And of course, on top of the things that you can control in an OTT service, there are all of those things that you can't control.
Absolutely.
You know, and in many places, broadband is not getting a lot better as quickly as many of us would like. How do you think that's going to affect the expansion of OTT and live linear and TVE services?
Well, we definitely think a lot about broadband and broadband penetration. What we see is the histogram looks different. And so if you took an average and I had to give you a number, I would definitely say, yeah, broadband speeds are up. But the reality is that the folks that were already pretty fast have gotten faster.
Right.
But the folks that are on the lower side of the histogram, on the bottom side of that average, haven't really gotten any faster. And so we're really starting to get into, and in many cases, it's a rural, you know, urban sort of split. But even within urban environments, there are just certain folks that don't really have a lot of competition in the market right now, and they're not really pushing and innovating as fast as other people are. And so we're starting to get in a little bit of a have and a have-nots sort of situation, which is not ideal. I mean, you know, we would like everybody to have access to very high-quality internet. We're not there yet.
Right.
And unfortunately, as I said, we're really not seeing that bottom line move that much, and somehow we have to figure out how to, you know, pick up that lower end bit rate, because ultimately, you're going to try to cater to as many people as you can, but what you don't want to get into a situation where you just basically select a segment of the market that you effectively can't serve because you don't want them to hold back the product for the other 70-80% of people out there.
Right, right. And that brings me to 4K and HDR.
Sure.
And you know, you attend a show like Streaming Media East or West or NAB or CES, and it's all about 4K HDR, which is wonderful for those who can get it. You know, realistically, how big do you think the impact of those two technologies in particular are going to be on services like the ones BAMTech works with?
I mean, I think that, you know, you have to separate the two. I think 4K and HDR I see very differently. You know, 4K is not all that impactful from a customer standpoint, to me, relative to HDR. So if you take a 1080p HDR feed and you put it up against a 4K non-HDR feed, 99% of people are going to say that the HDR looks better. And you know, 4K is one of those things. In order to really maximize it, you have to have a certain size display and a certain size living room, et cetera, et cetera. And when you start thinking about things like a lot of people are still watching on laptops, or iPads, or different types of connected devices on a much smaller screen. 4K doesn't really buy you anything.
Right.
HDR does immediately. So even on those displays, HDR is going to give you better blacks, better color depth, things like that look higher resolution, even though the pixels aren't more. Better pixels, not more pixels. And so in our minds, better pixels wins. So that's the one that we really think is impactful. And, you have to sort of be able to do both, but really it's the HDR side of it. The good news with that is that things like H.265 are maturing. They're not there yet, but they will be. And hopefully, the compression gains in H.265 can take something like HDR and offset it. So for kind of the same bits that you were getting, if not slightly better, you're able to actually deliver a much, much higher quality product. And so it's definitely stuff that we're keeping tabs on, but there's a little bit of natural tension in these services all the time, because a lot of device manufacturers want to push the envelope and say, hey, we want to go do all this really cool stuff, especially the display manufacturers. But the reality is that the ecosystem to make that content is very complicated, and some of it is somewhat baked in, in the ways in which things are done. And some content that was shot, much content that was shot, isn't shot in 4K.
Right.
HDR still gets you some gains, which is again why I think it's important. But all of that has to catch up, and so it's still been a while. And there's not a lot of great standards out there in H.265 yet, as far as distribution and things like that. We're big supporters of CMAF. We think that'll be a good gateway into getting H.265 content out there across multiple platforms. But it's hard. It's a hard thing. It doesn't just turn on a dime just because somebody can make a display that can show those pixels. Doesn't necessarily mean those pixels are available to show.
Right, right. You mentioned H.265 a couple of times. To what degree is the royalty question holding things back in terms of progress on I guess all fronts using it, whether it's gaining efficiencies or getting better quality, and also a little bit, how do you see things shaking out between HEVC and AV1 VP9?
Well, I think that the royalty thing is always an issue. People have really good patents that were filed on the backs of a lot of really hard work to make these things go, and in some way they need to be compensated. At the same time, it can't be one of those things where all the air in the ecosystem comes out just because somebody's got a compression codec. There are a lot of other very expensive things that you have to pay for when you're putting one of these streaming services out. So it can't just be an additional thing. I think, MPEG, I think with the consortium on the H.264 side ultimately did a pretty good job. I think it got put in, the economics were tenable. Certainly nobody likes to pay more money, but they were tenable, and it moved forward. I'm hopeful that H.265 will get there as well. I think that some of the other sort of more open sourcey codecs on the other side, I think those are really tough, because I think that there's one perception that says, okay, well, they're out there and they're royalty free, and so I'm just going to go use it. None of those things have really been tested, so it doesn't necessarily diffuse the legal landmine. At some point in time, there may be a lawsuit that says that those things infringe. And if they do infringe, then you're back into the lawsuit with probably even less favorable options than what you have on the front end with something like H.265 licensing with MPEG LA or somebody else. So I do think it has frosted the industry a bit. I think that the uncertainty is definitely one of those things that has slowed adoption. I'm hopeful that it will work itself out. I don't think that making a bunch of open source codecs, again, people could argue about what's better or worse. I think there's pros and cons to both. But whatever it is diverting resources from coming up with the best codec the industry can deliver the second that you start to fragment it into more than one.
Sure, sure. And while we're talking about codecs, let's talk a little bit about bit rates these days. What's sort of the state of the art in the maximum bit rate that you can push for a live MLB game consistently?
We generally are in the 5.5 to 6 with live content at the higher bit rate. That gives you full frame, full raster at 60 frames a second, and pretty good looking stuff. Part of it that you always look at when you look at scale is the thing, when you talk about CDNs, you talk about sort of ballistics and things like that. Again, there's the what do people actually realistically get across the board? And you start looking at these segments of folks that have different bandwidth availability. But it's also, the CDNs act as this caching layer that you have to be efficient with. And so putting out a 20 meg feed that 1% of people can go is not necessarily economically feasible. But it also does things like not necessarily seed the cache in the way you would like to. So that the rabbits that all would seed the cache for the 7 meg feed are now at the 20 meg feed. And so you've just killed all the rabbits in the 7 meg feed. So now the 7 meg feed is underperforming because the caches are not as warm. So a lot of it is when you start to do things at scale, you have to really be cognizant of the ballistics of what you're doing. And so just putting out sort of arbitrarily high bit rates to cater to a very small percentage of folks actually has a detrimental effect on all the rest of the folks that are in the mix, especially in live, with a lot of concurrency. So being able to understand what that's going to look like, what the heuristics of the network are going to look like under different loading conditions, under different times of day, things like that. It's a lot of the expertise that we've developed that's hard. And it's never a zero-sum game. Like everything that you dial, every dial that you turn in one direction has an effect on the other dimension. And so you have to like fiddle with them to the point where you're optimizing for what you think is the best experience for the overall totality of your customer base.
Sure.
Back to the bandwidth example we just had, let's just say that it had a detrimental effect. Well, the person that was on the low end of that was getting a 2 meg stream on DSL that now can't get a 2 meg stream and they're getting a 1200K stream, they're a big risk for churn. So it's not so much the person that canceled because they couldn't get a 20 meg stream and they were getting a 7 meg stream, it's the folks on the downside that you have to really worry about. And so if there's 8%, 10%, 12% of folks that are in that bandwidth condition, that becomes a huge opportunity for churn. That's a real problem. You can't just churn those folks out just because you want the high-end bit rate. And it's not just about buying more CDN or working more efficiently. It's about the reality of a caching environment where you have to be mindful and cognizant of the way that the cache is coherent across all different CDNs, devices, platforms, ISPs, et cetera.
Sure. Speaking of different devices, what sort of breakdown are you seeing in your typical viewer device makeup? I mean, what sort of mobile viewing are you getting versus big screen viewing?
Yeah,
is it changing?
It changes. It definitely is changing a bit. Everything is growing, quite, from an empirical standpoint. Web, which used to be huge, continues to shrink as a percentage, but it's still healthy. I mean, generally, we're at the, it depends on the content, depends on the partner, et cetera, but somewhere between 25 and 30% or so on web. And then when we get into mobile, again, it depends on the content. Is it short form? Is it long form? Things like that. Are you weighting it by play session? Are you weighting it by volume of content consumed? But somewhere, those are kind of evenly split between mobile and living room devices.
Okay.
The living room devices are by far the largest growing segment. So more and more people are having a living room device, and they're using it more. So when you look at it from a minute standpoint, it's even more disproportionate. So living room devices by minutes might be half of the traffic at this point in time. And it makes sense. It's a high quality experience. It often is now the principal way that people are getting things. It's not like look on TV, see if there's anything interesting to watch. If there's not, I'll turn on Netflix. It's,
right.
I go to Netflix first. I go to HBO Now first with intent. And so we're definitely seeing that the living room stuff is growing. And really, I think for us, that's validation that it's just going mainstream.
Right.
Is that people are just accepting the fact that this is the principal way that they may consume content. Again, services like Hulu, services like PlayStation Vue, I think only reinforce the fact that there's the ability to just have that as an entertainment device and not miss out on anything.
Right. Do you think with services like Hulu, PlayStation Vue, the other live linear services out there, how soon before we reach a saturation point where, I mean, how many services can the market sustain, I guess is what I'm curious about.
It's
early days, but.
It's early days. I would say it this way. How many types of cell phones can the market sustain?
Right.
Like everybody was like, oh no, like the cell phone wars will cool off. It's like, I don't know, they seem pretty alive and well to me.
Right.
Every time I turn around, I see a billboard for a new one. So I don't think there's an infinite supply and demand curve, on the linear streaming services, but I think it may be bigger than what people think it is. And I do think that there's different takes. I mean, if you look at PlayStation, you look at Hulu, you look at Google, you look at a couple of the other ones that are out there, they are different. I mean, there are different packages, different channels included and excluded, but also just different UIs, different feature sets, different mechanisms for consumption. And I think that's good. I wouldn't say, oh, this one's better than that one. I say that they're all different. And I think most people do a pretty good job with it. And so I think that while there's still the ability to innovate in the consumption model, the dialogue with the customer, the visual language that you're inventing for this service, I think that there can still be a lot of proliferation there, and it'll be a fight to get customers. But the thing about that we do know is that there are customers entering the pipeline. So it's not one of those things where everybody's got to go take it from somebody else. It's not like a cellular carrier, in the U.S. at this point in time, where an ad for Verizon is a loss for AT&T or somebody else. We're in the situation where that entire market segment is continuing to grow over time. And so I think as long as that's true, the pie can continue to widen. There can continue to be more folks that are in there, as long as they're adding value, as long as they really have a value proposition. So I actually think the market's going to be a lot larger than what people think because of that fact. Growth spurs competition. Competition allows for fragmentation.
Sure, sure. What about, it seems to me like the hype around VR has cooled off just a little bit.
You mean 3D?
Exactly, exactly. Do you see VR and AR having an actual impact on what companies like BAMTech do and what services provide?
Well, I mean, I think that, look, the industry has seen it, and I joke about 3D, television,
right,
in the way, because I think that's an indication of where the industry was being led by the consumer device manufacturers. So the consumer device manufacturers, they're great people. We love them all. Mm-hmm. But the reality is that they went into a situation where, people bought a TV every 7 years, let's say, and then all of a sudden we had three things that all happened at the same time. We had a government-sanctioned mandate for frequencies, to be called back, i.e., HD transition. We had an aspect ratio change, mm-hmm. Right? And we wound up in a situation where, for the first time, we could make really thin displays. So you can make very large displays that were way lighter. We could have made a tube. It would have been really expensive. That was 70 inches, but it would have weighed 1,000 pounds. Mm-hmm. So those three things all happened at the same time. And so they went from a refresh cycle of 7 years to a refresh cycle of 3 years. And it was awesome. And they're like, this is great. We need to figure out how to keep doing this, right? And I think 3D TV was an example of it. I think to some degree there's VR is a little bit of an example of it. It's like people wanting to have that kind of churn about display and consumption metaphor. Even if there are different entrants into it. I think it's good. I think it's great that people are innovating and trying to figure it out. What I would say, though, is that it's a little bit of cart before the horse. Mm-hmm. And so I think that VR is a great example of it's very immature. The devices are still first generation. Think about, on the AR side, think about something like Google Glass.
Right.
That was actually a pretty long time ago. And it still hasn't caught on with the mainstream. Like, there still isn't a device out there that does it. So it was very ambitious for Google to try to lead the way. But it just shows what a gap there is and what people are actually willing to do and interact with. So I think they will both get there. AR, I think, more so than VR, to me, makes a lot of sense. I was talking to somebody and like, I don't see augmented reality, all this kind of stuff. And it's like, well, how many people think that their cell phone is sort of an extension of other things that they're doing anyway?
Right.
If you Shazam a song or something, SoundHound a song, or ask Siri to figure out what the song is, like, that's augmented reality. That's you getting data from a machine, in a little bit more kludgy interface, but like getting to learn things about your environment that's being augmented by the device that you're carrying.
Right.
The notion that that's built into eyeglasses doesn't seem all that far-fetched to me.
Sure.
So I think that AR is a little bit more straightforward in the sense of there are already use cases that would be great to use in AR. It's just the technology is not quite there. VR is I think, a little bit more of a challenge. Gaming works really, really well. When you can control 100% of the environment around it, you can synthesize an environment, it's phenomenal. And I think that's where obviously we've seen traction. I think when it comes to trying to tell a story with it, it's really challenging. Especially in sports, I think when you think about it, it's like you have to put the camera in a place that is, number one, a place where people can't get to with a regular lens, and number two, actually tell something to advance the story. So it's like, most of the stuff that I've seen in VR and sports are cool little snippets of like inside the huddle or this thing or that thing. But to actually watch a baseball game or watch a football game, like in that way, is not there yet. You can't really tell the narrative in a way that's compelling. And so we need both the creative side and the technology side to advance on that. So I think VR is a little bit further behind than AR is.
What about on the monetization side of things, specifically in terms of ad-supported content? It's how long have we been talking about the advertising models being broken and the advertising technologies not being quite there yet? Where do you see advertising, particularly programmatic and server-side ad insertion, heading? Is it getting better? Is it getting to a point where people aren't going to look at a service and say that they feel like the ad experience is broken?
Well, I think I think it's getting worse in the sense of there are more folks that are in there are more folks that are in the ecosystem with an opinion, and obviously those opinions are not harmonious. And so a lot of people think, hey, it should be done this way, it should be done this way. This industry group thinks it should work like this. This agency thinks that it should work like this. And ultimately, none of those folks are responsible for the user experience of somebody who's actually trying to sell a product to a customer. And so I think it's tough because there's a lot of stakeholders and they don't agree, and most of them, 90% of the folks that are in there, don't have any experience at all at creating a high quality dialogue with one-to-one customer. And so I think that's tough. It's a big challenge. That said, I think the technology is maturing, so people are trying to get around those things in better and more elegant ways. So I think it has improved over what it was, but I'm very focused on things like defect rate. I think right now people sort of gloss over it because it's like, well, 98% of the time it works great, and therefore I monetize. But I think when we start to peel the cover and people really start to understand like this ad solution versus that ad solution from a technology standpoint, especially in a model where we're going D2C, like an OTT model, people are really going to understand the difference between good ads and bad ads because it's going to have a direct effect on the monetization and the OTT side. And right now, because the audience is small, the OTT direct monetization is going to be higher than the additional ad load. Eventually, it will have to get sorted, and so I think it will get sorted. But like the hybrid model, I think, is one of those things that has powered the cable industry for a very long time. If we wind up in a hybrid model as being there, and certainly in live sports, you have these natural breaks, and so you're going to wind up in a hybrid model at some sort, then there's a lot of difference between the best ad solution out there and the worst ad solution out there. And what I would say about all of them is none of them are good enough.
Okay. Let's back up to talk specifically about BAMTech a little bit more. You know, you're in the enviable, or maybe unenviable, position of you control the entire workflow.
Sure.
Right? What have you learned, and what are the biggest challenges you face trying to manage, you know, that end-to-end workflow from ingest to delivery?
Yeah. It's tough. I mean, I think that, you know, end-to-end is always a funny thing because everybody defines it differently.
Right.
So,
is it here? Is it there?
yeah, is it there? Like, you know, from the back side of the camera lens to like actual people paying with credit cards and consuming in an app is the way that we sort of define it.
Okay.
And as you said, we've done a lot of things that are, you know, maybe not exactly the camera lens in all cases, but certainly from finished content on. And end-to-end, and it's got a lot of experience. And I think that, you know, this is one of those things that is a real chance for us to innovate, and I think we have innovated. I think that we're continuing to innovate, and we're really adding a lot of capabilities to the product. And we mentioned the Disney transaction. You know, the proceeds from that we're using to make the company better. We're acquiring some companies, we're acquiring talent, we're doubling down on things that we couldn't necessarily fund at the same level before. We had a venture back, you know, investment, so to speak. But I think that the thing where people sometimes go astray is that things are not as modular as we would potentially like them to be. And so saying like, look, I'm going to get the best, you know, the dream team, right? I'm going to draft the best technologies that are out there, like best in class in every single one of these 2 dozen slices that you need to have in order to make something work. Putting those all together is really hard. And so I think people that generally adopt that philosophy are not the ones that are necessarily the highest quality product that are out there. In some cases, it may be the lowest cost, but from a quality standpoint, it's very difficult to get a whole bunch of vendors to work together. And so while we do provide end-to-end, we also license various different components to it that we think are best of breed and fit into it, but we pre-integrate those into our offering so that our customers don't have to worry about it. Like they know we're standing behind it end-to-end, like that's us. Increasingly, we also do portions of workflow for folks. So, you know, it's not 100% you have to take our whole solution.
Right.
We have gotten more modular. One of the things, as I said, from the proceeds standpoint, was making some investment in having things like SDKs that we can put out so that we don't have to do 100% of it. There's still in the grand checkerboard of things you can do and things you can't do. We're not going to do all these things bespoke, but there will definitely be more modularity to what we can do than just end-to-end. But it's hard. And I think that, again, this gets into, you know, we want to be a high-quality company. We don't want to race to the bottom. The thing I would like people to say about us is, like, if you go with BAMTech, we are going to make you the most money.
Okay.
You know, as opposed to, like, we're the cheapest provider or least expensive provider out there. We're going to make you more money because it's going to work. It's going to have the fit and finish that's going to be required to command the premium dollars that you're asking for folks. And you're not going to have to worry about, is this thing going to work? You know, we're going to make you the most money. Because every technical glitch, every rough ad boundary, every one of these things that contributes to a poor user experience is going to result in churn.
Right.
And so at some point in time, you're just managing to that churn number. one could make the argument to overstate it that like if you look at the churn number, of a company, you want to look at the growth number because you never want to see a flat top. But if you're looking at churn, it's probably the best indication of how healthy that product is. And so I think when people are out there, not every consumer that's looking for services is shopping that way right now. And so I think those that do, we do very well with. But I think if people are looking for the absolute lowest cost, or I want to put it together myself and there's 30 different options, and I want to use all 30 of them, I don't necessarily know that we've had a lot of success in that or that we will be focused on that market. But as I said, we will be doing things, and we are doing things where we are doing more components of the workflow. And I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with that.
Which components are you seeing the most demand for on an a la carte basis? And I guess what I'm getting at is perhaps that suggests the elements of the workflow that more and more customers are having trouble with figuring out on their own.
Well, certainly, I mean, there's a holy trinity, if you will, between encoding, advertising, and player. And so those things have to really harmoniously work together. Otherwise, any one of those weak links is going to cause defects that will lead to churn. And so taking those three things together are really, really important. Now, you'd say, okay, what else is there besides that? I mean, there are commerce capabilities, there are building the actual applications and things like that, which traditionally we've done for folks. But if I can wrap that kind of core functionality into an SDK and then give it to somebody to build the rest of the app because that's what they would like to own, I think that's a good solution to it. But it's tough to like start chipping away at those three because if you don't have an ad supported, if it's just an SVOD with no advertising, then obviously you only have two axes on those. But the encode and playback are really very heavily tethered. And I think a lot of the innovation from a design standpoint, from an interaction model with the content, all those types of things really require like very, very tight control between those two things. And so putting up a stream that sort of comes with anybody that's HLS, that's H.264 and everything like that in a player is pretty straightforward. Making it work really well with milestone markers and very good adaptation and maximizing the bandwidth you can get to the device, highest quality encode that you could possibly do. All of these things are different. Those are hard, and so I still think there's a lot of innovation there. So for us, that core sort of video playback streaming encoding side, I think is something that we think is pretty special. We think we have a lot of experience at it. But maybe some of those other things like writing the entire application are not things that we have to do. And certainly from a scale standpoint, there are more mobile developers now, in 2017 than there were in 2014. And so there are more opportunities for people to build good mobile applications with a good development workforce. Whereas I think in 2014, let's say, or 2013, there weren't as many good folks out there. And so therefore for us, it made a lot more sense to try to do it end to end because we could deliver a much bigger value proposition.
Sure. Well, I'd like to open it up to audience questions now. I think, Joe has obviously got a tremendous amount of experience and insight into the industry, and I'd like to see what kind of questions the audience has. Jose will come around with a microphone.
It's where I get my exercise today.
Hi, Joe. So we're starting to see some ISPs like Comcast and AT&T, Cox, enforce home broadband data caps. So are you concerned about that at all? And have you thought about ways to address that, especially with a service like PlayStation Vue where people are going to be consuming a lot of live linear television?
It's a good question. Certainly data caps are not good, like from a content provider standpoint, from an OTT provider standpoint. So nobody wants them. Certainly nobody wants them to be super restrictive. At some level, they have to manage their network, so it's understandable. So you shouldn't be pushing a terabit out of your house, like I get. If it's 5 gig, then that's a different sort of situation. As far as how it influences product, I think there's a lot of interesting things that we've done. So for example, there's settings in a lot of our applications now that are like, do you want to use, for example, 60 frames a second video, which really means higher bandwidth video. It's the higher portions of our stack. Do you want to use those on only Wi-Fi or only on the carrier network or with addition on the carrier network? You can imagine that there's some more of those switches so that people can elect to say like, look, I'll sacrifice quality for efficiency of bandwidth, somewhat like what T-Mobile has done with Binge On. So I think that's a pretty good example of like, look, there are a bunch of folks that say like, if the data is free, right, or if the data is discounted, I'm absolutely willing to live with lower quality because I'm trying to manage my finances. So I think the more aggressive the landline providers get with things like that, I think you're going to see more options on services to allow the customer, to empower the customer to actually manage their bandwidth themselves. I don't think it's a healthy thing for the industry. I mean, I think a open, free internet, not free from a cost standpoint, but free of encumbrance, without onerous data caps and things like that, is what we believe is the right thing to do. It's give people, from a democratization of content standpoint, the ability to select what they want, but there are real hurdles out there. What I have seen is that, in general, we haven't seen things that are super onerous on the landline side, and even to some extent on the wireless side. So we really haven't seen people like clamp down. It really does seem right now like it's more for congestion mitigation and to try to cap the folks that are really abusing the system, that are really pushing massive amounts of bandwidth. But it's a worry. It's certainly a concern, and the regulatory environment is always fluid. I think no more fluid than this point in time than it's ever been. So it's one of those things that we monitor closely. But I think the only thing you can do from a brass tacks, other than lobby and other than try to make your point known to the powers that be that regulate such things, is to really give the consumers as much choice as possible and be as transparent as possible about, hey, if you do this, this is what the downstream ramification is. And again, we all hope that that doesn't have a chilling effect on the industry that we're in.
The question. Oh, here we go.
You talk about the defect rate can pushing the customers away. So I'm just wondering, there are like several factors. I would imagine like a buffer empty, or the variant change, or the startup time. So I mean, in your mind, that what's the relationship of each factors that correlate to pushing the customer away? And also for each one, that is there like a threshold? For example, the buffer empty, if it's as low as say once every half an hour, even if it's lower, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think that there's, we, from a relative scoring, like is startup time versus like rebuffering time / whatever, I think what I would say is, in a general sense, the stuff that interrupts the flow when you're in it is much worse. So for example, a rebuffering event or a bandwidth adaptation, like a bad bandwidth adaptation, going from one part of the stack to another, a lot of people aren't going to notice, but like if you fall off a table and it's like crystal clear and then it's a Magritte painting, I think that people are going to be impacted adversely. I think things like startup time are important depending on what type of service you have. So a lot of those things can be masked by user navigation, and you can sort of manage that. And I think that most people don't expect to see the first frame of content when they hit play. Now in live sports, if you're joining in progress, then 5 seconds seems like an eternity. But if you're in a situation where you're in SVOD and people are going to have credits and all sorts of other things and slates and advisory warnings and things like that, then maybe it's not as big a deal if there's a little bit more latency there. But things that impact your flow when you're there, I think, are the most important. Again, there's a lot of factors that can drive it. Could be Cdn congestion, could be you're having a problem at your origin, could be advertising, could be a lot of things that lead to it. But I think, it sounds somewhat obvious, but I think it's true, is that things that are impacting folks when they're in the flow, that's the stuff that is really like just going to drive directly to churn. Like at some point in time, you can have almost a predictive model of like, if this happens to such and such a degree, then this is going to be the resultant churn that's going to come out of it. And that's scary. It's also enabling, because you know that that's the case, and so what you're doing is your best job to mitigate any one of those things that you can possibly do. And again, that's what separates some of the good providers from maybe the ones that are not as good.
Hey, Joe, thanks for doing this. Was wondering if you kind of give an update on the state of Statcast right now. Are you pleased with where it is in its evolution? And if you could put your futurist hat on a little bit, where do you see that kind of data overlay or data presentation fitting in a future augmented reality world?
Sure. So for those of you who don't know, Statcast is the baseball product that essentially measures everything that's occurring on the field and can dimensionalize it. So how fast was this guy? How fast did they react? Did this person take the right route to the ball? Things like that. And so Statcast, I think, I actually am pretty pleased with where we're at. There's still a lot to do, and there's still a lot more innovation left in it. But if you think about the fact that it's really, from a practical standpoint, 3 years old, it's already made a pretty big impact on the game. When you see players and coaches talking about it, you see commentators talking about it, that's pretty quick, especially in the baseball, in the tradition of baseball, which is not necessarily so fast moving. So I'm very happy with the progress that we've made. I think there's a lot more progress that will happen. And to your point about augmented reality and things like that, I think it's a pretty good thing. I mean, again, if you rewind, I go back to the Shazam example, which, by saying Shazam, for many of the young folks here, they don't even remember what that is. It's just built into like Google or Siri or whatever they're talking about. But when you think about that, and you go, okay, well, 10 years ago, the notion that I'd be able to walk around and tell you what any song that was playing sort of in almost any environment with ambient noise and all that, if I told you could do that with a device that was in your pocket, you'd be like, okay, that's crazy talk. That's not reality. And then once you first see it, you're like, of course. And now it's just like, of course you can figure out what every song is. Like, you don't wander around wondering, like, I wonder what this song is. Like, if you really want to know, you pull out your phone, you figure it out. I think augmented reality is going to start to turn into that. And so I think sports is a great example of like, wow, that was a great catch. Here's my phone, let me point it at the field and let me see what that route was. That's the dream of it. And I think when you talk about it from a broadcast standpoint, the integration into like a streaming product as an example, I think a lot of that is, to me, it's going to be like video games. The same way in video games you have different HUD, kind of configurations, different overlays, different things like that. I think people are absolutely going to consume with different kinds of skin that takes the data that we're providing and renders it, synthesizes it into the stream in various different ways to give people more insight into the game. And so I think that we're already going there. I mean, for me, when I first started in baseball, the score box didn't exist. So like you often turned on a baseball game and you were like, oh, okay, well, what inning is it? Well, let me wait till a half inning when they're going to jog off the field and I'll get a chyron that tells me what inning it is, right? But the concept that you can't like just flip on a game now and see what the score is, see how many pitches into the count they are, see what the last velocity of the pitch was, of course it's there. Now, we didn't call it augmented reality, we just called it putting graphics on the screen, but it's a form of augmented reality. We're taking the principal photography and we're adding things to it in order to give people context. The notion that becomes more dynamic and user-driven is just the next thing. It will happen. It's just a matter of time. And what form it takes, I think, people from a futurist standpoint can guess. I do think StatCast is one of the things that baseball feels like is one of the things that is a form that it's taking. And the cool thing is it's now, and it works, and it's interesting. And so we're really excited about where it can go. And I think other sports like the NHL, we've been working with those guys on similar sorts of things. I think, it'll be cool. And hockey's problems are different than baseball problems. Like what you're trying to show is different, how you want to track it's a little bit different. But ultimately, it's that ability to build the narrative out so folks can get just context that shows how amazing the performance is of these people that are actually playing the sport.
Another question. I really like the idea of changing our definition of augmented reality. I think we've geeked it out a little too much with the word and makes it feel not true. Here you go.
Joe, when you're building an app or a platform for a third party, and you're trying to connect to their origin, their in-house CMS or database, MAM, whatever, are you building a connection into their system, or are you saying, no, we've got a CMS and an origin that you can use, and you figure out a way to get your content into it? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think that it's probably a little bit more of the latter, but there's always going to be some of the former. So we do have things like ESNI, we have things like cable lab specs and things like that people should be able to output from their system as far as like getting things out of a MAM as an example. So I think that we try to push people towards standard interchange mechanisms that they're either already supporting or probably should support because people know how to consume those. At the same time, the ability to sort of drive things from a CMS or from something like that, I think are things that we've definitely done custom integrations where we've done work on that to allow people to do it. I think when you're the content provider and you come to somebody like BAMTech and say, look, we'd like you guys to help get us this product direct to consumer. Part of it is trying to really understand what it is you're trying to achieve. Is there a reason that you really want it to be in the CMS? Like your CMS, is there's like real special value added sauce in there, or are there really going to be different people managing it anyway? And so they can use tool A or tool B. It really doesn't matter. Because if they can really use tool A, then we can save a whole bunch of money by just actually using more of a standard workflow. And so I think increasingly we're seeing folks come to the realization that oftentimes it's, the use cases that require this incredibly tight coupling with the upstream systems are not really use cases that you're going to experience. It's probably a different editorial staff maintaining that application and programming it than it is the people that are doing sort of programming the other way. That said, again, things like ESNI and some of the stuff that, ITER and some of the other things that are kind of like trickling down are really important because you don't want to reprogram a linear EPG just for an OTT app. So you definitely want to be able to draft off of those. But my advice to folks is try to get your internal systems to a sophistication where they can publish the kind of latest, greatest standards that are out there. And at that point in time, the handoff becomes pretty trivial in sort of getting folks to ingest it. But trying to like dip too far back, I think, is an error that people make. They want it to be super, super synchronized. And the reality is that in a super synchronized, tightly coupled way, the slowest aspect of that system, from an innovation curve standpoint, retards the velocity that you can have across the board. Whereas if you make them a little bit more asynchronous, where you have these rally points of things that are common that you can hand off, then you've freed it up to have velocity curves that are different. So if your internal systems can't quite maintain the same velocity curve that a direct-to-consumer product does, you don't really have to worry about it. And so, a lot of it, people I think can really focus in on the front end and save themselves a lot of grief trying to go too deep. Hopefully that answers your question.
Time for a couple more questions. Yeah.
Joe, you mentioned CDN congestion. How much of a split do you think it is between ISP bottlenecks and CDN bottlenecks in your delivery of your content?
It's a great question. I would say that it depends on the day. So it's a little bit like the weather in that you see a little bit of everything. There's no question that it used to be, 5 years ago, I would be up on the stage and people would say, what's the biggest challenge in delivery? And I would say, last mile. The last mile connections aren't fast enough. That's what the problem is. Last mile is well sorted for 70% of the people out there, 60% of the people in the US. The 40% is back to those bandwidth folks that still have DSL that really do still have a last mile problem. But by and large, the congestion has moved up into peering, I would say. And so it's not necessarily the CDN itself that's congested, and it's not necessarily the ISP itself that's congested, but those bottlenecks at peering, I think, are still where we really see hotspots in congestion. And it's because people are just moving a lot more content. So you might have had peering links between this ISP and this CDN that were 20 gig, and that was plenty, but now 20 gig doesn't get you very far. And so it's one of those things that we're members of the Streaming Video Alliance, one of the founding members of it, very involved with it. Open caching is one of the things that we're really pushing for folks as well, which hopefully alleviates some of those peering congestion issues because it allows ISPs to essentially cache further into their network in a very prescribed way. So I think that there's work going on to try to eliminate that bottleneck, but right now I'd say that's the biggest bottleneck that there is really those, like, how do you get out of really the public network and into the delivery network is where you see the most, churn, basically.
There's a question all the way in the back here.
I now think that you guys are just trying to run him, so you're just like staggering the questions.
I know, really. You could have gotten together on this, folks.
Up here next.
Yeah,
You
exactly.
have the favor. I love that you mentioned the last mile problem being something we used to think is the biggest difficulty in live streaming. But now, what about the first mile problem? And a company like yours, with the advent of like WebRTC and the inevitable death of Flash, sorry if there's any Adobe people in the room, where are some of the first mile problems that you now see?
Well, I think
Ingesting live public content.
I think that there's no question that getting into the CDNs at some point in time can be a challenge. The difference, I think, is that that's a little bit more in your control. So, you can do things like direct connect. You can do things like different types of file acceleration to, transport acceleration to get into the CDNs. And so there's no question that there's some challenges there. Those things are generally solved, though, by going broad. So one of the things that we typically do now with most of our content is multiple different origins. And so it's not getting back to a single choke point. There are different origins with different carrier complexion of connectivity and things like that, more direct connect, more advanced transfer protocols. And so there are definitely challenges there. We feel like we have a pretty good solution set. So of the things I lie awake in bed at night, that's not one that I worry about. However, it is a problem, and we did have to put a lot of engineering behind it to get around those types of problems. And so I'm sure that there are other people that maybe haven't gotten around it yet that are experiencing those, but at least it's one of those things that's a solvable problem. The access issue is a lot harder to solve just because so many more companies own different parts of that workflow. So there may be 3 or 4 companies, maybe 5 companies that have something to say about that particular transaction. And so it's really tough to get everybody rallied around the same thing. Whereas generally, if you're talking about ingest into somebody else, you're talking with 1 or 2 providers, and that's a big issue. But I would also say for like live linear and things like that, we don't generally use public internet contribution. Like the stuff, if you're trying to make like a PlayStation View or a Hulu type thing, you really are still dealing with dedicated broadcast type feeds, and they're probably IP. You know, we're not spinning up transponders on satellites or anything like that, but they are an MPLS network or a private network, so that we're not going over the public internet, and we can have more control over it, because obviously it's a multiplication factor. If you take something that's, you know, 5 nines or 6 nines to start with, then everything downstream is just going to take 9s off. There's nothing downstream that's going to add any 9s. And so you want to start with the highest quality that you could possibly have, so that you have the most reliability to start with, and then you'll start eroding it naturally as you go downstream, because there'll be things that are outside of your control.
Excellent. Well, I think that's all we have time for here. I want to say a big round of applause and thank you to Eric Schumacher Rasmussen and Joe Inzerillo.